This is a lecture on natural selection for the e-school biology class. Natural selection is the way that Darwin proposed that evolution occurs. So at the time, Darwin was not the only person coming up with these ideas, but he was the first one to publish and the first one to get credit for these ideas. So natural selection is just a process by which evolution occurs, not evolution itself, which can produce all kinds of different interesting organisms, such as this star-nosed mole right here. Natural selection is a mechanism, which means it's a way that something happens by which individuals inherit beneficial adaptations, and they produce more offspring on average than other individuals do, therefore increasing the number of individuals in the population with that beneficial adaptation until everyone has it. This has to be a heritable trait, something that can be passed down from parent to offspring, not something that is not heritable, like a haircut or a tattoo. There is a struggle for survival due to overpopulation and limited resources. So when organisms are born, not all of them are going to survive. There's going to be some that starve to death or are eaten by predators just because there is a limited amount of space and too many organisms to live in it. Darwin proposed that adaptations arose over many generations, and those adaptations are what allow organisms to survive longer than their peers, therefore giving them the benefit and passing those adaptations down to their offspring. So natural selection has four main principles, and these four things are what show how evolution occurs through natural selection. The first one is variation, and variation just means that all organisms are a little bit different from one another. They may not look all that different to you, but these two organisms have a difference in jaw size. One of them has a larger jaw than the other. Even organisms which appear to be all of the same to us, things as small as ants or bacteria, have genetic and phenotypic variation within their population. Not everybody is different. Not everybody is the same. They all have some small differences that distinguish them from one another. That is the concept of variation. Second is overproduction. Overproduction means that all organisms have more babies than will survive. Even people, not all of our offspring survive to adulthood. So some organisms will have lots and lots of offspring to counteract this, but then some organisms will just still have a smaller number of offspring, and even those, not all of them will survive. Some of them will live longer than others, and that's typically the ones that have the adaptations. An adaptation is a trait that an organism has that allows it to survive. In this case, an adaptation is not a thing that an organism does, but a trait that it has. So an adaptation is a noun, not a verb. These jaguars are not adapting to have bigger jaws. The adaptation that some of them have is a bigger jaw. So this adaptation allows some of the jaguars to get more food, like maybe being able to eat this turtle here that his other companions may not be able to because their jaw isn't big enough or strong enough to crush the shell, which means that this one gets more food. It doesn't have to look as long for its food to find, and therefore it can spend its time on finding a mate, reproducing, and passing its traits on. Then this guy has more offspring that will be likely to survive because they will also have the same adaptation of a larger jaw that he does as well. And that leads us to descent with modification. Each generation is a little bit different from the last because each trait is being passed on, that the adaptations are being passed on by the ones that are able to survive longer and get more food and find more mates, and therefore soon all of the organisms in that population will have that same trait. So this is what determines fitness. Fitness is a measurement of survival ability or the ability to produce more offspring, and so adaptations lead to being able to do those things. Natural selection does act only on existing variation. Natural selection cannot produce traits, but it can only act on things that already exist. New traits can be introduced through things like mutations or new individuals coming into the population, but the trait has to be there before natural selection can act on it. So natural selection only acts on traits that already exist. However, structures can take on new functions in addition to their original function. For example, this panda has a modified wrist bone that allows it to grasp the bamboo. Since pandas are bears, they do not have opposable thumbs. Notice that all 5 fingers are on one side of the hand. but it is a great advantage for the panda to be able to grasp its bamboo in order to eat it. So the wrist bone has been modified in order to make that grasping possible. Any pandas that were able to grasp their bamboo were able to get more food and spend more time finding a mate and reproducing rather than hunting food and trying to eat their food. So they had an advantage, and now all pandas have that same modified wrist bone. One type of natural selection is called sexual selection, and that's when a certain trait increases mating success. This occurs because males have a much lower cost of reproduction than females. Females have a high cost of reproduction because eggs are very expensive to produce and they produce a limited number of them. Males can produce lots and lots of sperm in a short period of time, and they don't have any limits as to how much or what areas in their lifetime they're able to produce it. Males produce sperm continuously, but females are limited in the number of offspring they can have, in the number of eggs they can produce, and those eggs are also very expensive energy-wise in order to make. So females are very picky about the mates that they select. They want to make sure they are getting the best genetic information that goes into their offspring to help their offspring survive. So there's two types of sexual selection. The first one is intrasexual, and that's when there's competition among males of the species. That's like these elephant seals here fighting on the beach for the harem of females, or these gazelle fighting each other in order to have mating rights. So males fighting males is intrasexual selection. Intersexual selection is when males display a certain trait to attract a female, like a male lion has a mane, and that attracts females if it is darker and fuller. This bird here has this chest that puffs up with air to attract a female. Same thing with the peacock here. The peacock shows his tail to attract a female mate. Female peacocks don't look like this. They're just brown. They kind of look like big chickens. So those are the two types. Intrasexual means that males compete, and intersexual means that females are attracted to a certain type of male, and they have a trait that they display to attract their mate. So species can also shape each other over time. This is called coevolution. And coevolution is when organisms' evolutionary paths become connected. The species evolve in response to changes in each other. This can happen in two ways. It can occur beneficially. So, for example, these acacia trees and ants, they each have a benefit here. The ants live inside the acacia tree, so that provides them with food and shelter. And if anything tries to eat this acacia plant, then the ants swarm out and bite it. So it gives protection to this acacia tree. So both are benefiting, and any acacia plant has these species of ant in it, and this species of ant only lives in the acacia tree because they have evolved to be together all the time. Coevolution can also occur in competitive relationships. So this is usually between predator and prey, where the crab is eating the snail. Okay, so in order for a crab to eat the snail, it has to have big enough claws to break the shell, which then natural selection will then favor thicker shells, because the ones that have the thick shells survive longer and are able to have offspring. But then the thicker, spinier shells, that favors crabs with bigger claws, because they want to be able to eat, which then favors shells that are thicker and spinier, which then in turn favors bigger claws on the crab. So in response to one another, they're developing new traits and passing those on to their offspring. It's important to keep in mind that populations are evolving, not individuals. So one individual cannot evolve. It doesn't change. Once you have the DNA that you have, that's not going to change in your lifetime. But a population or a group of the same species will evolve over time. So natural selection acts on the distribution of traits. It acts on how often we see those traits occurring. So a normal distribution is a graph that looks like this, where the mean has the highest number of individuals, and the farther away you get from that mean, the fewer number of individuals there are. The highest frequency is near the mean value, and the frequencies decrease toward each extreme. This is what we see in traits that are not undergoing natural selection, because not everything is being selected for at the same time. So anything that is not undergoing natural selection has a normal distribution. But if it is undergoing natural selection, we can see these different modes and how they apply to the specific traits. So this is for microevolution within a single population. It's an observable change in allele frequencies, and it results from natural selection. If there's no change in genes, then it is not evolution. So it can't be something that is just a exterior change. It has to be a genetic change. So directional selection favors phenotypes at one extreme. So for example, antibiotic drugs that put pressure on bacteria populations. So some bacteria naturally have a high resistance to antibiotics and others do not. So when you take antibiotics, if you stop taking them before the full course, some of the antibiotics or some of the bacteria that are in your body that were drug resistant survive. Those will reproduce and produce a population of bacteria that are more drug resistant. So the whole population shifts in one direction. Stabilizing selection favors the intermediate. So that means that the ones on both extremes are selected against, making the mean more common. An example of this is with the gall fly. This fly right here lays its eggs in the stems of plants and it produces what's called a gall here. If the gall is too large, then the woodpeckers can see them and they peck them open and eat them. If the gall size is too small, then that leaves room for this wasp to also lay his eggs in that stem. The eggs will then hatch earlier and eat the gall fly larva. So the medium size is the best. If they're too big, they're eaten by woodpeckers. If they're too small, they're eaten by wasps. Disruptive selection favors both extremes. So that means that the mean is bad, but both extremes are good. This bunting bird here is an example of that. These bunting birds come in two colors, blue and brown, and some of them are both blue and brown. If they're blue, then the females like them, and if they're brown, then the females like them. But if they're blue and brown, then the females think they're ugly and no one wants to mate with them. So therefore, the blue is favored and the brown is favored, but blue and brown is not. So we can see here the changes that are made through these types of selection. Stabilizing selection, we go from a normal distribution where these are selected against and becomes more skinny and more close around the mean. Directional selection pushes the mean in one direction, and disruptive selection divides the population into two groups while the mean decreases. That's all for today. Please go ahead and finish your assignments and contact Ms. Jewett if you have any questions. Thank you.